Alright, Chapter 5, Object Perception. Challenges in identifying objects. Our ability to recognize objects goes far beyond what's immediately familiar. Only occasionally do we come across a genuinely unfamiliar object. Knowledge influences our perception. Our ability to detect objects must overcome three aspects of the environment: image clutter, object variety, and variable views. So, let's talk about image clutter. How do we find the object that we are looking for? To overcome image clutter, we must discern the object despite the overlapping presence of nearby objects. Although detection of objects is normally easy, increased clutter can make it difficult. Just think of Where's Waldo? 2. Object variety. How do we distinguish similar objects from each other? We must recognize a particular object as a member of a particular class or category, despite small or large differences in our general prototype of that category. For example, TV remotes all look kinda similar, so we usually have no difficulty assigning these devices to the correct object category as TV remote. 3. You laughing at me? Variable views. How do we recognize the same object from different points of view? We must recognize an object despite it being placed in very different orientations relative to us and casting different images onto our retina. We must be able to identify the same object from different vantage points. Note: variable view is particularly important when it comes to face recognition. You want to be able to recognize your friend regardless of the angle at which you are looking at them. Fun fact: the same object looks very different from different angles and creates very different images on the retina. But people with normal visual perception have no difficulty identifying an object at different angles. So, TLDR, object recognition actually is a computationally difficult task for our visual systems. We take these tasks for granted. More challenges in identifying objects. Another challenge is implementing object perception in a machine. This is getting better all the time in computer systems, but it does bring up issues in the context of face recognition and self-driving vehicles. As object recognition software improves, it is likely that self-driving cars will ultimately become much safer than human driving. Also, in the case study of Dr. P, he could identify the pieces in great detail, but not the entire object. This is object agnosia. Alright, object agnosia, another challenge in identifying objects, is an acquired deficit in identifying and recognizing objects, even though vision remains intact. It's weird, I jumped from 1 to 2 to 5. Don't know how that happened. We're on to top-down processing and bottom-up processing. Alright, bottom-up and top-down processing help us connect the physiology and psychology of perception. In sensation and perception research, we seek explanations both at the neurological level and the psychological level. One way to view this distinction is in the cognitive psychology logic of top-down and bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing is a process whereby physical stimuli influence how we perceive them. This is relatively straightforward. Our eyes detect reflected long-wave light when we examine a red object, so we see the object as red. Importantly, bottom-up processing is the influence of transduction and neural processing on perception. It will not always be successful because of poor signal quality. Top-down processing is a process whereby our existing knowledge of objects influences how we perceive them. So, we perceive a rose because we already know that roses are bright red and have a particular pattern of shape and shadow. If we did not know about roses, we would be lost in this case. Importantly, top-down processing is the influence of prior knowledge on perception. This helps us deal with the environments that are cluttered, or visually noisy, like identifying a friend in the crowd. Recognition and representation. Recognition and representation are two components of top-down processing. Because existing knowledge is important to perceiving objects, it is necessary to have a memory system capable of storing this knowledge. So, memory and perception are integral to understanding object perception. Recognition is the ability to match a presented item with an item in memory. The perceptual matching of something currently present to our visual system with a stored representation in memory. Basically, think of a police lineup. A witness is shown several possible suspects, and they must pick out the one who was seen at the crime scene. Note: recognition implies that we know something about what we are seeing. we are able to match the object we see with a stored memory. We must recognize specific objects as members of larger classes. Example: we must recognize the object on the shelf as a screwdriver. We must also recognize objects as specific instances of that category. For example, that screwdriver on the shelf is my favorite screwdriver. Fun fact: being able to recognize specific instances of a particular category is vital in face recognition. You must recognize a person as, for example, your uncle, rather than as a member of a category, such as men. And we go now. Alright. Representation. Representation is the storage and/or reconstruction of information in memory when that information is not in use. The processes that translate stimulus information into a perceptual experience of that stimulus. So, an object appears in the visual field. Neural processes detect it and send an image to V1. The process of representing that object starts immediately, in parallel across the dorsal and ventral system. The representation then is the neural code for what the object actually is. If you consider a class of objects, like familiar faces, we need to be able to represent information about them. We need to be able to represent the general form of human faces and the specific forms of particular human faces, like your mother, your brother, and your landlord. So, TLDR, recognition is just identifying objects, matching a perceived stimulus with an item in memory, whereas representation is all about when not perceiving a stimulus, how is the information about an object stored in our mind. Representation refers to the structure of memory. The nature of representations. Some people speculate that our representations are image-like, so you use your experience to represent what goes on in your head. It's similar to the image itself. This is kind of like visualization. But others speculate that our representations are more language-like. We may represent things in language, and this is referred to as propositional. Propositional is all about memory being like language. Think of storing information in words, just like computer code. Also, a more formal representation is the connectionist representation. So think of all your knowledge being stored in a network of neurons. The connectionist representation is just representations contained in a network of neurons. And a fun fact here is that at some level, representations are neural, which means they are stored in some configuration of connections and activity between neurons. Perceptual organization. This is the Gestalt stuff. Perceptual organization is the process by which multiple objects in the environment are grouped, allowing us to identify multiple objects in complex scenes. A big part of this chapter is the principles of Gestalt psychology. Note: Gestalt is not a person. It is a school of thought that is all about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. So basically, think about how our perception is organized. What stands out to us most is the pattern, or the whole, how we see the form that all its parts make up. Gestalt also includes ideas about consciousness. The principle of totality, realizing that consciousness is holistic and a dynamic process within the brain or the mind. So, TLDR, Gestalt psychologists in the early to mid-1900s described many principles of perceptual organization, and to explain consciousness, we must think about a dynamic or holistic process. Gestalt principles. Grouping. Grouping is the process by which elements in a figure are brought together into a common unit or object. Basically, grouping is how we see items as belonging together. Segregation, then, is the process of distinguishing two objects as being distinct or discrete. So basically, segregation is just separate objects out from each other. Think of using the differences in color to separate objects from one another. When it comes to segregation, we might also use the contrast info that we detect on edges. Segregation helps us determine where one object ends and another one begins. So, when we look at scenery, segregation helps us to determine where one object ends and another one starts, like with a cityscape. We do not consciously think about segregation, but we do use it to avoid bumping into stuff. We segregate objects to be able to navigate through the world effectively. And a quick note here is that depth is another way that we can segregate. So, TLDR, we group objects to bring some of them together, and we segregate objects to sort others apart. We segregate objects by color, contrast, and sometimes depth. Figure ground organization. The experience viewers have as to which part of an image is in the front and which part of an image is in the background of a particular scene. Figure ground organization is one of the most basic principles of grouping. Scenes are often perceived as meaningful objects against a general background. We think of the face-vase illusion. This is figure ground organization. When we perceive a figure, we perceive it against a background, or something in the distance. Gestalt psychologists use the figure ground as a basic grouping principle. So, diving into this, you can perceive one stimulus in two different ways. Your perception shifts from moment to moment. You may be aware of the faces one moment, and then the vase at the next moment. If we perceive the vase, then we say that the white region is the backdrop. If we see the faces, then the orange becomes the backdrop. Now we got some rules of figure ground organization. There are rules that determine what we see as a figure and what we see as the ground. These are attention, depth, symmetry, convex side, clarity, distance, and simplicity. So let's get into it. Attention. We can change what the background is by focusing attention on different things. There are limits to our ability to attend to objects in a given scene. This also relates to reading, as we focus on each word to get the full meaning. So, what becomes the background can change depending on what we focus on. Similar colors may blend into the background if we do not attend to them. Depth. The figure that appears in the foreground is often below the figure that appears in the background. Lower portions are more often seen as figures. Think also about your line of sight. Most often, the lower half of your line of sight will have stuff that is more likely to be perceived as the figure, like the desk you're about to walk into being in the lower half of your field than the rest of the classroom. Also, with the face-vase illusion, we are more likely to see the vase when the position of the orange area is shifted down, but we are more likely to see the faces when the position of the white area is shifted down. Symmetry. A figure with symmetrical borders is more likely to be judged as being in the foreground than in the background. Convex side. Convex images are perceived as figures, and concave images are perceived as ground. A figure is more likely to be perceived as being in the foreground if it is seen on the convex side of a border. The figure that appears to be in the foreground is the one with outward bulging borders, or convex borders, not the one with inward-facing concave borders. So the convex band is in the front, and the concave band is in the background. Clarity. A fuzzy background makes the foreground figure more distinguished. Distance. Things that are closer to us are perceived as being the figure, whereas more distant objects are perceived as the background. And finally, simplicity. The principle of simplicity may help explain how some of the other principles work. This is overarching, so if all other aspects are equal, then we will perceive the simplest interpretation among many. Think of the Olympics logo. The rings are the simplest interpretation of how we may see this design. We see here that familiarity and simplicity work together to help us understand the world. Gestalt laws of principal grouping. The law of good continuation. Figures that have edges that are smooth are more likely to be seen as continuous than those with edges that have abrupt or sharp angles. And a note on this is that similar to the concept of interpolation or completion, we often fill in the missing gaps and perceive whole objects. In Figure A, most people see a horizontal orange bar behind a blue vertical bar. This is because the two orange rectangles would meet if each was extended. So we see them as continuous behind the blue vertical bar. In Figure B, the two orange rectangles would not be continuous behind the blue vertical bar. Therefore, we see them as two separate entities. The law of proximity. The law of proximity states that elements that are close together tend to be perceived as a unified group. Items close to one another tend to be grouped together, whereas items farther apart are less likely to be grouped together. The law of similarity. Elements that are similar to one another tend to be perceived as a unified group. Similarity can refer to lots of features, including color, orientation, size, or motion. Law of symmetry. Elements that are symmetrical to one another tend to be perceived as a unified group. So think of your hands. Similar to the law of similarity, this law of symmetry, suggests that objects that are symmetrical to one another will be more likely to be grouped together than objects that are not symmetrical to one another. The law of common fate. Elements that are moving together tend to be perceived as a unified group. This ties into the law of common motion. Objects that move in the same or nearly the same direction are seen as a single group. Think of watching a flock of geese move across a sky. The The geese are all flying in the same direction at approximately the same speed. Therefore, we see them as a Gestalt group, or a flock. And a fun fact here is that these Gestalt laws are not technically scientific laws, but the name has just stuck. So, TLDR, Gestalt psychologists developed several laws that predict how perceptual groupings occur under a variety of circumstances. Application. Gestalt principles in design. Many of these Gestalt principles are incorporated into advertising and web design because they capture our attention. Good websites take advantage of Gestalt principles to play on people's intuitions and make them remember or recognize what they are supposed to do. Perceptual interpolation. We infer the continuation of objects even when they are partially blocked by other objects. Perceptual interpolation is just the process by which the visual system fills in hidden edges and surfaces in order to represent the entirety of a particular visible object. Fun fact, this interpolation is similar to good continuation. One important process used in perceptual interpolation is edge completion. Edge completion is the perception of a physically absent but inferred edge, allowing us to complete the perception of a partially hidden object. Note here is that edge completion has survival value. Also, illusory contours are perceptual edges that exist because of edge completion, but are not actually physically present. Illusory contours demonstrate that edge completion can create objects that do not exist. A quick note on this is that a bistable image is like the screwy cube that messes with your eyes. It alternates between two different perspectives. With this, you get a vivid 3D perception from a 2D image. Time for neuroscience stuff. Neuroanatomy and physiology of object perception. The ventral system is the what pathway. This pathway works its way through the extrastriate cortex and then continues on to the temporal lobe. One of its main functions is object recognition. The dorsal stream, then, is the where pathway. This pathway works its way through the extrastriate cortex and then continues on to the parietal lobe. Its concerns are locating objects in space and perceiving motion. Specific regions beyond the visual primary cortex. V4 is an area of the brain involved in both color vision and shape perception. V4 neurons seem to have a clear preference for edges, but a more complex analysis of edges than seen in V1 or V2. V4 neurons can respond to edges that are either straight or curved, whereas V1 neurons show a strong preference for straight edges. Also, like V1 neurons, V4 neurons respond to contours. However, V4 neurons respond to either convex or concave contours. So, this area is involved in delineating shapes, which is necessary for object recognition. V4 is interesting because it seems to represent basic shapes, things like circles, triangles, and squares. This is more complicated than the line segments that V1 represents. Inferotemporal area, IT. This is the area of the temporal lobe involved in object perception. It receives input from V4 and other areas in the occipital lobe. As we continue the what pathway, we involve more complex object processing. This happens in the inferotemporal area, which is a subregion of the temporal lobe. Important, the inferotemporal area is where face recognition occurs. So, TLDR, object perception involves areas in the extrastriate cortex, such as V4 and the inferotemporal area. The representation of basic shapes form in area V4, and object recognition happens in the inferotemporal area. More on V4 and friends. Alright, V4 response properties are more complex than V1. V4 responds to curved contours as well as straight ones. V1 feeds its information into V4. V4 has a large enough receptive field that it captures multiple receptive fields from V1. V4 is also involved in color perception. V4 facilitates the combination of color with object information, whereas V1 is just color alone. So, V1 will detect red, but it will not know what that color is attached to, whereas V4 can detect color and it can tell what object has that color attached to it. Inferotemporal neurons have much larger receptive fields than V1 and V4. Inferotemporal neurons might respond to a specific shape anywhere within the cell's receptive field. Comparatively, the receptive fields of simple cells in V1 are quite small, dealing only with small line or edge segments in a particular orientation within the receptive field. The inferotemporal neurons combine information from a large spatial expanse. So, the inferotemporal neurons let you recognize your car as yours or a car as a Corvette, if you are a car expert. This process happens in higher level areas like the inferotemporal area. Important. If you recognize somebody's face as familiar, that face lands within the receptive field of a neuron, and that neuron combines all sorts of stuff. Shape, features, etc. Combining everything into a single whole, perceiving the face as a gestalt. The eyes and the lips and the nose come together to make a face. The receptive fields of inferotemporal neurons can be thanked for this because they are large. Also, in V1, there are feedback pathways running into the thalamus, so we think a similar thing happens with inferotemporal neurons. Inferotemporal neurons send information back to earlier cortical areas. Inferotemporal neurons are hypothesis testing in this way. The inferotemporal neurons have an initial hypothesis about what an object is, and so they get more information by sending signals back to earlier cortical areas to test their hypothesis about, for example, whether the thing you're looking at is a bird or a plane. The fusiform face area and face recognition. Getting more into face recognition here, the fusiform face area, FFA, is an area in the inferotemporal area of the temporal lobe that specializes in recognizing familiar faces. This is the region where face recognition really occurs. Damage to the FFA results in prosopagnosia, or face blindness. The FFA is located on the ventral surface of the temporal lobe. Most research now suggests that the FFA is involved in the recognition of familiar faces. After an object has already been perceived as a face, we use the FFA to distinguish Aunt Sally's face from Aunt Mary's, rather than identifying a strange array of colors and textures as a face in the first place. The occipital face area, OFA. This is an area of the brain in the occipital lobe, associated with recognizing faces as distinct from other objects. The OFA is located in the extrastriate cortex and is strongly connected to the FFA. The occipital face area appears to be responsible for making the initial identification of a face as being a face, regardless of its familiarity. The OFA is an area associated with recognizing faces as distinct from other objects. So, TLDR, the FFA is associated with the recognition of familiar faces in humans, and the OFA is associated with recognizing any face as a face. Other inferotemporal areas with specific object recognition functions. The parahippocampal place area, or PPA, is an area within the inferotemporal cortex that appears to have the specific function of scene recognition. This area is selectively tuned for the recognition of spatial landscapes, both indoor and outdoor scenes. This area is responsive to photographs of spatial landscapes, but shows no additional activity when images of people are present in those landscapes. And here we talk about topographic agnosia. This is a deficit in recognizing spatial landscapes, related to damage to the parahippocampal place area, or PPA. Yes, this is the form of agnosia that accompanies damage to the PPA. And then we have the extrastriate body area. This is an area within the inferotemporal cortex that is activated when its cells view bodies or parts of bodies, but not faces. This area is responsible for visual recognition of body areas other than faces. And again, that is the extrastriate body area. Okay, let's talk about prosopagnosia. Damage to the FFA results in a condition known as prosopagnosia. This is a selective deficit in recognizing faces. Prosopagnosia is a neurological condition in which face recognition is impaired, but other forms of visual object recognition appear relatively intact. So, a patient with prosopagnosia will have difficulty recognizing particular people, but will not have difficulty identifying roses or gloves. Note: prosopagnosia usually occurs in patients who have had strokes, but there are some cases of people being born with it. Important: patients with prosopagnosia recognize faces as faces, but they fail to recognize specific faces, even those of close family members. Example: When a prosopagnosia patient is presented with a photograph of the face of Will Smith, the patient will be able to identify the object as a face, but will not be able to tell you that it's Will Smith. A person can have impaired face recognition, but intact recognition of other objects. In a comparison of prosopagnosia patients and object agnosia patients, patients with object agnosia were normal at face recognition, but showed deficits in object recognition. In contrast, the prosopagnosia patients showed deficits in facial recognition, but not object recognition. Ooh, and a little fun fact here. Prosopagnosia patients can recognize familiar people by other cues, like their voices, their particular way of walking, or some distinct facial feature like a big nose or a large facial scar. So, TLDR, damage to the FFA results in prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia is different compared to object agnosia. Prosopagnosia is only for faces, whereas object agnosia is broader, as it applies to many objects. Finally, we talk about grandma cells and coding in the inferotemporal cortex. It is possible that a single cell may store information about a particular person. This is why we call it the grandma cell. The grandmother cell is a cell that stores information about your grandma. Researchers have looked for the engram. The engram is the specific location of a specific memory, such as the visual identity of your grandma. Note: face perception is so important that we often see faces in lots of places, both in toys and illustrations, and even where faces do not exist, like the face on the moon. And to this point, animacy is just seeing faces as looking alive. And this gets into the uncanny valley stuff. The textbook talks about it a little bit, but we didn't talk about it much in class, so I'm wrapping it up here. This is everything for Chapter 5 of Sensation and Perception. It's been fun. Thank you for watching, and best of luck. Goodbye.